former Soviet Union. The red on this map are Russian majority populations. The orange are Russophilic populations. They like Russian culture, they speak the Russian language, they're just not actually Russian citizens or Russian ethnics. And then the green, those are what I like to call the Stockholm Syndrome states. They really, really miss the Soviet period. Now, the entire western periphery of the Russian system, all 2,500 miles of it, the highest physical barrier between the Russian populated zones and everybody else is about the size of a Kansas interstate on-ramp. Wide open territories that everybody has loved to march across throughout history. And so the Russians think of themselves as incredibly insecure. Now, in the Russian ideal, the Russian army would be able to sweep forth and plug these 5 geographic gaps, from the Baltic to the Carpathians to the Caucasus. And the Russians feel that if they could pull that off, the territory that they have to defend shrinks from 2,500 miles to 600 miles. And that is something that they could do with an army that's half the size that it is today. So that's their goal. When you look at things like Ukraine, you're really just seeing the first step. There are 9 other countries that have to fall. Someone, somewhere, will think that targeting or manipulating energy infrastructure is a particularly good idea when a war starts to rage, whether it's the Russians looking to cut things off to a rival, or a target looking to deny the Russians leverage. And here is the Russian oil and natural gas export network. 6 million barrels per day and 15 BCF a day of natural gas, facing some degree of supply risk simply from military activity. That alone, half of that alone, would be enough to add $100 to your average barrel of crude. Not to be outdone, there's the Middle East. The United States has kept the Middle East open, has always had a carrier battle group in the region specifically to keep the Saudis and the Iranians apart. The idea being that in any sort of free trade environment, which was core to our security throughout the Cold War, so you have to keep the energy flowing, otherwise there is no trade order. You'd have a global recession in a matter of days. Well, we don't care anymore. You may have noticed the aircraft carriers haven't been on station for half of this year. That's not the new normal. That's a transition to the new normal where they're not there at all. Now, the Iranians and the Saudis are starting to eye each other warily. The Saudis have been more aggressive in this. They're actually pushing against the Iranians in 8 major military conflicts throughout the region. Syria, by the way, is what it looks like when the Saudis are winning. Ugly, but that's the Middle East. These two are opposed politically, economically, militarily, strategically, you name it. And because of the shale revolution, they are now transporting exactly the same product along exactly the same routes to exactly the same customers. This is going to break soon. And in particular, I want to point out a couple of areas. That's a really long-winded way of saying that this is basically just another great rivalry. So think of it as kind of like the Texas A&M UT rivalry, just with more guns. And like all great rivalries, eventually some fans end up at the wrong bar. And that's what these are. Up here in Iran at the UT Tower, they call it Khuzestan, you've got 3 million ethnic Arabs in a Persian state. The Arabs are seen as a dispossessed, troublemaking minority, and curfews are pretty normal. Khuzestan happens to be sitting atop 80% of Iran's oil production, and the Saudis have already targeted the Arabs of Khuzestan as a potential 5th column. Not to be outdone, down here in Kyle Field, the Saudis call it Gwar, also home to the Abqaiq oil processing facility in Ras Tanura, the world's largest offloading facility. You've got 3 million Saudi Shias in a Sunni country. The Iranians are already very active trying to penetrate that population. Just these 2 red arrows point directly at 11 million barrels per day of production and export infrastructure. That assumes that nobody else gets caught in the crosshairs. That assumes that the Kuwaitis or the Emiratis or the Qataris don't get involved at all. If a quarter of that comes offline, you have another $100 per barrel. Not to be outdone, you have East Asia. Now you'll notice on the left all those green bars and on the right all the red bars. The green bars are net oil exports. The red bars are net oil imports. They're a convenient 7,000 miles apart. And if we enter into a world where either Russian supplies or Middle Eastern supplies are compromised at all, there is not enough physical crude to supply everybody. So if you are in Korea or Japan or China or Taiwan, the only way that you can make sure that your needs are filled are to actually go to the Persian Gulf and get it. So we're going to have convoy systems again. It's been a long time since that, huh? And as we all know, the Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, and Taiwanese have a centuries-long history of brotherly cooperation and love. There's no chance that anything will go wrong in that. Not only are those four countries going to have to pick sides in a Middle Eastern knife fight, should we have one tanker, just one, come under attack or confiscation by one of those four navies, that is the end of the global supply chain system. The supply chain system of the last 70 years has been built on the concept of cheap and safe maritime transport. So you take a supply chain and you break it up into pieces. You get the chairs from Malaysia, you get the engine block from China, you assemble it all in Mexico. You break it up to whoever can do that step of the chain cheapest. You raise the marginal cost of transport by 1%, half of the world's supply chains are no longer viable. That alone is enough to shatter the Chinese system. There's another dozen reasons, but this isn't a China presentation. I want to look at two more things, then we'll open to questions. First of all, these are the energy plays of the future, so you know who your competition is. Anyone who is blue can't mess this up from an energy production point of view. Anyone who's green, you could mess it up, but it really takes some forward thinking. A couple things I want to point out, like, for example, Saudi Arabia. They have to not fall in a war with Iran. That would really crimp their energy output. Or Brazil, really you just need to shoot everybody in Congress. I mean, you guys think Sacramento or Washington are bad. Wow, go to Brasilia, it's a nightmare. Countries in yellow. These countries could make it, but it's going to require a very steady hand and a lot of very forward-looking policies for them to kind of pull themselves out of the fire. And for countries in red, you are looking at a quintessential breakdown in the capacity of the countries to produce crude. So you're looking overall at probably a 30 to 40% reduction in what is freely available in global crude markets. The price increases from that are actually very good for you, but it's going to make for a very complicated supply picture for California writ large in the years in between. And then here we've got tight oil production from the major plays. The green and the dark blue shades are the big three plays of the Permian, the Bakken, and the Eagle Ford. Here is the Monterey. I don't see this as a negative. It's that little red sliver on top. That's all it is. I don't see this as a negative. The shale sector has spent the last 10 years building up a set of best practices that are now in the process of percolating across the industry and will be the norm by the end of next year. To give you an idea of where you can fit into this, because of 4D seismic, you can be more productive in your first day than the Texans were in year 7. Think of water. What were the numbers that Oliver gave us? 14,000 gallons per well? 20. Okay, that comes down to about 400 gallons per barrel. Now, a shale well, when it's being instituted, uses about 10 million, but you only have to do that once. So it uses, over the life of the well, 1% of the water. You can ride, you've got the second mover advantage here. You already have the legal infrastructure, you already have the financial infrastructure, you already have half of the physical infrastructure. You can have a boom that is much faster than anything that happened in Pennsylvania, North Dakota, or Texas. So a tripling in 5 years, it's theoretically possible. You just have to survive until the world goes to hell. With that, let me leave this up. This is what I call the global stability map. Countries in blue are the ones that will rule the chaos to come. Countries in green, more or less the same situation they're in today. Yellow and brown are where things start to fall apart. If you are in yellow, you have something going for you. A unified population, self-sufficient in food, a strong ally, something that will let you meet the challenges of the new era head on. You won't always win, but you'll still be there. If you're in brown, you won't. and you're looking at state breakdown, particularly along the edges. If you're in red, if you don't know a country that's in red, don't bother learning their names now because they won't be there in 5 years. All right, you guys have been great. I think you are the first audience I've had in 3 weeks that actually laughed at every single joke, and that means a lot to me, so thank you.